You may not always think about your postdoc environment as a space where learning and teaching happens, especially if you are not working directly within the classroom. We asked a group of postdocs to reflect together on all of the ways they use teaching and learning skills in their day-to-day work. Let's watch their conversation.
Hi, I'm Rosa. I'm a postdoc at Northwestern University, and I work in the cell biology department.
Hi, my name is Dima. I'm a postdoc in the University of Michigan at the School of Kinesiology.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elise. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Concordia University in Montreal in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Planning.
Yeah, so one of the environments that I thought that I often use teaching is when I explain what I do to the general public. And I never really thought of that as a teaching experience. So I thought this activity was a nice way to reflect on that. So I work a lot with cell biology. So I think when I explain this type of stuff to the public, my family, my friends, I often have to explain it in more general terms and make sure people understand really the background information and explain in layman's terms, and often connected to things that they understand, like certain diseases and references. So I thought this activity was a nice way for me to kind of picture my teaching in a different area of than the actual classroom.
So one of the scenarios I thought about was when I'm mentoring PhD students in the lab group that I'm in. And one of the experiences I have is mentoring a group that's working together of a PhD student and an undergraduate student that are conducting a literature review project. And something that I thought about is while I'm not directly involved in that project, my role is to pass on any knowledge that I got while conducting systematic literature reviews when I was a student. And some of the ways that some of the teaching skills that I have applied to this is making myself available for questions like I've done in office hours in the past. So having a office hour block of time that I'm always available for them to come in and ask questions. And then also showing examples of good work from other projects and other published areas, as well as asking them to set realistic goals that are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time dependent at the end of each meeting so that expectations are clear. Another scenario that really occurred to me only as I was doing this activity is using teaching skills during a job interview for a tenure track faculty position that I recently did, where I feel like I've used different teaching skills throughout the entire interview process during giving my job talk and as I prepared it, as well as during the one-on-one interviews with different faculty members and graduate students. And the audience or the learners in this situation were potential future colleagues and graduate students that I could be working with in that position. Some of the skills that I realized I've been using there is relating my work to daily life and applicable scenarios that the audience might relate to, and then making sure I'm using inclusive language and diverse examples when I'm presenting different examples of my work, as well as presenting clear objectives and highlighting the impact of the work.
So I could identify like 3 situations of learning and teaching out of the classroom. And maybe the first one is like when I help PhD students or members of the lab, like colleagues, students, when they have like issues with their everyday life in research and teaching. Like recently, one asked for feedbacks about a course she was giving, for example, or other needs feedbacks from an older colleague who passed the same exam a few years ago. Second situation is more a situation of mentoring PhD students, like it could be your colleague and mentees. For example, when I'm transmitting a technique, a method of mapping, for instance, because it's my field. And I help the PhD student to build his or her own experiment. I usually share example from I get from my experiences. And for example, I can share documents I produced in the last years in the same situation of teaching classes and conferences, exams. We have a lot of papers we wrote, and sometimes this is like notes, but these documents can be very helpful for people. And I'm also trying to create connections between people who might have the same issue at the same time, or who have had this situation before.
What I was thinking of during the discussion too is the situation of being in a group meeting and providing feedback to students who are presenting their work and helping them overcome obstacles. And when you were talking about community and accentuating shared experiences, that was one of the things I put down as sort of using, ensuring to provide positive feedback and motivation to students in meetings and mentees that you're working with. So in addition to the constructive criticism, how important it is to motivate your students with positive feedback, or mentees that you're working with. And then the other thing that came up for me was providing a safe space for asking what could be perceived as like dumb questions or silly questions that people might be nervous to ask, especially when you have multiple people in the meeting environment rather than with a one-to-one mentee environment. And so in lab meetings, a technique that I've used that I took from class is asking, instead of saying who doesn't understand the specific term, I'll ask who does understand, and kind of use positive language that way to sort of provide this shared experience of, you're not the only one who's a little lost here. So let's clarify.
I like to use is kind of like I mentioned before, and similar to what we said with making a community of connecting people, but kind of connecting ideas together and understanding what does someone understand, and then how can I relate these new topics that I'm trying to explain and teach to them and connect them to something that they already know. And then I think it's important as we're doing this to give the people or the students or whoever you're teaching some time to process it, and then not only encourage questions, but kind of almost flip it back on them. So instead of them just asking questions and responding with answers, giving them questions in response so that they can process things and actually think through the answers themselves. I also think a good teaching strategy is to have people actually teach what they've learned. So you can kind of ask questions. How would you explain this? Can you explain this to me? And when someone's actually teaching something, you can actually see if they've learned something. Yeah, I think asking a lot of the times, well, why do you think this happened? Or predict what happened if you were to do this instead. And that gives them a way to actually think through it themselves instead of being like, oh yeah, if you should have done it this way and it would have been better. So kind of thinking about all this, I didn't really put together how often I have teaching moments. I feel like a lot of the time I'm like, my class is 6 to 9. This is the time I'm teaching. This is the time I can improve my teaching. And I never really thought that there's all these other situations where I'm put in teaching situations. And these are opportunities for me to try new strategies and work on my feedback approaches and ask for evaluations on how my teaching is going. So I think really makes me realize that there's a lot more opportunities that I can take advantage of for improving my teaching and working on it.
While I think I've developed these strategies of setting clear goals and expectations and values that are important to me, and I'm going to be keeping in mind of this feedback loop and how to constantly adjust those and tweak them to suit the different individuals that I'm working with.
And the diversity of situation you mentioned is a really appealing concerning this fact. And even at home, we try, of course, to explain our research to somebody who isn't familiar too. So maybe it's the first point. And second one is that we can be in the position of the learner and the teacher, and it changes, and it's not depending our age, it's not depending our place in the academic. And sometimes we are learning when teaching, and this is a particular form of teaching. I finally realized that the teaching requires an emotional comprehension, and even inside or outside the classroom. A good learning and teaching situation is a situation where you're aware about the relationship.
Presenting yourself as a learner in different situations makes the space more open and collaborative. And I was thinking that that definitely is true for other relationships that we have in our lives. So even with, roommate or partner that you're negotiating a new space with, or a new relationship that you're working on, it seems that to me, it seems that maybe if we do present ourselves as learners and trying to understand the other person's values and the other person's workflow, would be even sharing an office space with somebody would be more productive than sort of imposing our own teaching methods of this is how things should be done. So that's another area that I hadn't thought about before until you mentioned this. So.
What struck you about the ways that learning and teaching can play a role outside of the classroom? Are there things you would incorporate into your own practice? You may want to review and revise the ideas you wrote in our prior reflection grid exercise based on what you heard.